Moody's Analytics, in its latest note, expects the Bangko Sentral to take a measured approach to monetary policy easing. With us now for more from Singapore, Sarah Tan, economist at Moody's Analytics. So good to see you again, Sarah. Welcome back to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me back here.
So first, what do you make of the projected rollback in fuel prices here, just a week after they went up at the pump? Might what have had, in a way, had an impact on consumer sentiment, you think? Because we've witnessed for ourselves just how volatile global oil could be and upending purchasing power.
Yeah, that's a good point. In the recent past few weeks, we've seen up and down of oil prices, and even in the Philippines, the retailers and petrol companies are all reacting to that volatility. I think the higher oil prices that we've seen over the last couple of weeks is really that premium to guard against any permanent supply shocks. And now that there's been some kind of stabilization in tensions, we've seen those fuel companies roll back those hikes.
Yeah, if we just refer to the risk matrix in your latest report, but that was stated last month, where would escalation in the Middle East tensions be? Would you color it red or green in the risk matrix? Because what I'm seeing now is something colored in the green, and if I get it right, it's about the US-China tensions.
Yes, so this is our risk matrix for us when we set our baseline forecast. We have this part in green, which is the US-China tensions, and this relationship between the US and China have kind of the tensions have eased over the last couple of months with the Geneva trade truce and the London talks that they had in June. Now with the Middle East conflict, that will definitely be in red. It will be a new risk for the global economy, and the Philippines is definitely not spared from that.
Indeed. So it would be red, but what about the other factors? I mean, would it still be in the green, the risk of China-US tensions? Because Trump just said he's not going to extend the July 9th deadline.
Yeah, so with all these developments, I think we might see the China-US tensions come to kind of another hot and cold situation, right? We might change it to just black, leaving it as where it is now today, with no further escalation in tensions. Yeah.
All right, it's going to be more difficult if one were colorblind, but let's have a look at your conditioning assumptions. That is a pretty interesting illustration there and articulation in the same note, because it marries Brent crude oil without a monetary policy rate assumptions. What are your findings here?
Yeah, so when we talk about the recent Middle East conflict, that could lead to higher inflation in the Philippines because as a net importer of oil, the country is vulnerable to disruptions in the global energy markets. So any increase in crude oil prices would then raise fuel and transportation costs, and that will then put upward pressure on inflation, and in turn that could delay the BSP's planned monetary policy easing, and then that will affect things like household budgets and potentially slow the country's economic growth.
So it's like a domino effect there, and I know that you've got your inflation rate forecast for June at 1.4%.
Yeah, so we have it edging up slightly to 1.4% in June this month. In June. And there are two main reasons for that, I think. The first is that the cut in rice tariffs took effect in the second half of last year. And so now that we are entering into June, that year-on-year comparison won't look as low as they did earlier in the year. Right. And secondly, it's really due to the global oil prices that we just talked about. The conflict in the Middle East pushing oil prices higher. And we've seen, at least for 2 weeks, Philippine retailers have already increased the fuel prices. And so even if they come down in the last few days of June, that's not really going to push down June's inflation by too much.
That's true, but what impact might it have on the Bangko Sentral's own inflation forecast range? It's out any moment now, and the Philippine Statistics Authority is going to follow that through with the official result this Friday.
Yeah, I think we have the consensus at around 1.5%, and so that range would serve as a good gauge for where we expect the BSP to put that month ahead inflation at. So I think we might see the middle point at 1.5%.
So you're expecting this measured approach from the Bangko Sentral. Given that you have inflation down at 1.4%, how many more rate cuts, if any? And if so, in which meeting? Is it going to be in August, October, or December, and why?
That's the million-dollar question. I think we have the BSP delivering one more rate cut by 25 basis points before the end of the year. Overall, I think there is still room for further policy easing to support economic momentum, and lowering this key policy rate would definitely ease pressures on household budgets and provide much needed relief to the domestic economy to help cushion the effects of challenging global environment. And the million-dollar question is really when this will happen. We think the odds are higher for an October or December rate cut and not in August. Firstly, because after 3 rate cuts this year, I think the BSP will want to watch how that is flowing through the economy, given how monetary policy easing works with a lag. And even though the BSP is not in lockstep with the Fed, it might still be appropriate for the BSP to watch what the Fed is doing before making its next move.
So no decoupling, Ben?
It's hard to say, KB.
Well, let me pick up an economic momentum. I know that my last reading is a 5.9% GDP growth from your end, but what impact is that measured approach going to have on Philippine growth now that the government's already cut its own growth goals to 5.5% to 6.5%?
Yeah, so in the past 2 months, we've brought down our forecast for the outlook for the GDP, for Philippines GDP. We have it now expanding at 5.7% this year, and that is well within the government's recently revised growth target of 5.5 to 6.5%. Overall, the domestic economy will still stay rather resilient, and as inflation stays low and that monetary policy easing filter through the economy, that's going to support private spending. But really, a lot of that downward revision for us really comes from the external environment, and that's due to the tariff hikes from the US and potential slowdown in the global demand acting as headwinds to the economy, right? So if the negotiations with the US tariff freeze doesn't go through, we will see a 17% reciprocal tariffs on Philippine goods, and that's going to really cast uncertainty over the short-term outlook for exports and production.
Just as a final point, Sarah, what impact will the peso's level have on any of the assumptions you have?
Oh, that's a good point. So the weakening peso we've seen over the last couple of weeks, I think that is something that we are watching out for. It lost some ground recently after the BSP lowered their key policy rate. But I think the good news is that the peso has shown some signs of stabilization in the past few days, and really the main risk for the peso comes from external factors. And that's going to feed into decision making by the BSP when they consider, things like a rate cut.
Got that. So that's 5.7% for GDP and 1.4% for inflation. I'm all up to speed now, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time and your insights. Sarah Tan of Moody's Analytics in Singapore.